he is the conductor of the Lincoln funeral train and so forth. And I had an opportunity to meet him over last month at Leviathan when the train was there and so forth. What a day that was there. We had a table set up to hand out brochures. My wife said I'd be like a little kid in a candy store. I left her at the table and I took off. She didn't see me the rest of the day.
That's why she's still smiling?
But I dropped her off and I picked her up to take her home. And I was on my own. But anyhow, I'd like us, are there any first-time visitors here tonight? No first-timers? No? Okay. Well, I'd like the rest of us to give the visitors a nice, warm Hershey welcome first. And without a due moment lost here, Steve, I'd like to introduce you and let you do your thing and so forth.
Yes, well, my last name is Torrico. The Torricos come from Sicily. They immigrated to Buffalo, New York in the 1920s. And in my lifetime, I've had the name Torrico spelled many different ways. And so this one is, I'm delighted with this version. So, this is the best, worst version of my last name that I have ever experienced. So, so first I was asked to introduce myself and tell a little bit about my history. So, actually, my job title at the Stone Gables Estates in Elizabethtown, I'm the general superintendent of the new Harrisburg, Lincoln, and Lancaster Railroad. And I'm 59, I turned 60 this year, so that's how old I am. My railroad career began in 1963, in the fall of 1963, when Petticoat Junction came on television. I've been told I had a red bandana, the engineer's hat, I had an oil can and gloves, and I would sit in front of the television set. I would sing the song, and when the show premiered, it was on Thursday night, and I had to behave all weekend in order to stay up late on a school night. I was the best behaved child anywhere in the 1960s. So I fell in love with steam railroading and a lifelong obsession with redheads because of Betty Jo Bradley. Now, Betty Jo Bradley was one of the three Bradley sisters, and she was the tomboy, and she didn't like boys. She loved the cannonball. And so that's why I love redheads and I love steam trains. I'm from Southern California, and on one fateful summer vacation, my mother found the Sierra Railroad located in Jamestown, California, which is up in the Sierra Nevada foothills just north of Modesto. And that is the location where they filmed Petticoat Junction. And so that became, every summer we had to go there, because that's where the real Hooterville Cannonball was. They watched me grow up, and the general manager to shut me up promised me a job when I got out of high school. And on my second day out of high school, when I was 17, I was on the doorstep of the Sierra Railroad, where I got my first railroad job. So that's how I started, and it was all because of the Hooterville Cannonball and Petticoat Junction. And as a side note, I had sought out and had found Mr. Paul Henning, who was the creator of Petticoat Junction. He was also the creator of Beverly Hillbillies and Green Acres. And his daughter, the beautiful redhead, Linda K. Henning, was Betty Jo Bradley. So I got a chance to know the Henning family, and Paul Henning was always loved. He told me that he always had fun telling his showbiz pals that a young man has a railroad career because of Hooterville. And that's true. So that's my history. We go through these last 40 years, and I worked in the short line railroad business, never working for a big Class 1 railroad. Always worked for short line railroads that had steam operations, and I got my steam experience through all of that. So it was in the fall of 2013, I was the general manager of the Saratoga North Creek Railway, running up in Saratoga Springs, New York, that ran up into the Adirondacks. And we had hired a 2009 replica steam locomotive of an 1868 Schenectady locomotive, and that a gentleman built in Elgin, Illinois. And he rented this locomotive out, and it would go to various tourist railroads for special events. So this is when I first saw this actual replica, full-size, complete identical replica of a 19th century steam locomotive. And we ran this on our railroad for several weekends, and the owner of the locomotive liked the way that I ran his locomotive so much that after that I became its traveling engineer as it would go around the country on various trips to different tourist railroads. Well, in the year 2015 was the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's death. And the gentleman who built the steam locomotive, he started it must have been 2012. He started and put a fund together to raise money, and he built a replica of Lincoln's funeral car. And the car was known, it had a name, it was the United States. And so he had the car ready. And so in the year 2015, he took his steam locomotive and the Lincoln funeral car on special trailers, and he took it on the route to the cities that the Lincoln funeral train actually went through, and had these open for tours for people to look at. Well, it was on one of those fateful trips that the owners of the Star Barn property, the Stone Gables Estates, David and Tierney Abel, they went to one of these Lincoln events, and they saw the Lincoln funeral car, and they saw the locomotive, and they were having a conversation with David Clokey, the gentleman that built it. And they asked David, they said, well, okay, after this 150th anniversary, what are you going to do with the Lincoln car? And David Clokey, who was in his early 70s and ready to retire, said, well, I think I'm going to retire, and maybe I'll donate the car to a museum. And Tierney Abel said, well, we'll build a museum. And the conversation started, and before too long, the Abels had learned everything about this Lincoln replica car and the locomotive. All right, so at the some of you I know have been over to the Star Barn property, the Stone Gables Estates, and on its 275 acres on part of the property was the original Ironstone Ranch that went back to the 1860s. And and I'm going to show you shortly here with this here. There's about a half a mile of the original railroad that ran between Harrisburg and Lancaster that runs through this Ironstone Ranch. And when they bought the property, that right-of-way was there. The tracks had been removed in 1903, but the right-of-way was all there, and since 1903, it had been used as a trail. So when they bought that property, they knew there was a railroad that was here at one time, and then they had learned that Lincoln's funeral train ran across the Ironstone Ranch when it came through Elizabethtown. So that was their connection to Lincoln. and why they went to go see the Lincoln funeral car. Tierney was on the front porch of the Ironstone farmhouse that's there today, looking down at where the train right-of-way was, and as she describes it, she had a vision from the Lord of seeing the Lincoln's funeral train chugging across that right-of-way and across the property. And it was actually Tierney's idea to go back to David Clokey and say, we'd like to purchase the locomotive and the Lincoln car and give it a home. So that started the idea of building a railroad. Well, I got involved because when David Clokey sold the locomotive and sold the Lincoln car, he said to them, thankfully, and thank the Lord, he said, when you buy this train, you need to hire Steve Torrico. And this indeed for me was divine intervention. It's just I'm here now for 12 months, 1 year, and whatever today is, 14 days is how long I have lived here in Elizabethtown. And it's been a really wonderful experience to be here and learn about this. So, I have this button. I know how to wind up Victrolas, but this modern devices are a little modern. So, this picture here, April 22nd, 1865, that photograph there is the original Lincoln funeral train that was sitting in the Harrisburg Depot. And it was supposed to leave at 9:30 a.m. and it was delayed because of bad weather, and they had to replace some of the bunting on the train. So the train did not leave until 11 a.m. When Lincoln was elected, he took the train from Springfield and took a route that was sort of a tour. It wasn't direct, but they specifically, he wanted to, it was a 1,600-mile trip to get to D.C. That was specifically so that the people could see the new president that had been elected. So upon his death, the Secretary of War Stanton had decided that they were going to put this funeral train together, and they would take his body back to Springfield, and they would go back pretty much on the same route that he took in 1861. So when the train went from Washington, D.C. to Harrisburg, and from Harrisburg to Philadelphia, and then from Philadelphia it went north to New York and up towards through Buffalo, and it went into Chicago and then down to Springfield. It was a 1,660-mile trip. They stopped the train at 441 cities. Over 15 different railroads and 22 different locomotives pulled the train, and over 3 million people saw this train. And 3 million people in 1865 is a lot of people. The train ran at an average speed of 15 to 20 miles an hour, so it was purposely done that to be very slow. So the train left here on the morning of April 22nd, and at 11 a.m. it got to Elizabethtown at 12:15, and it made a stop for 15 minutes in Elizabethtown, and then it continued on. The railroad at the time, and I think that's the next one. So the railroad here that was started in 1832 is called the Harrisburg, Portsmouth, Mountjoy, and Lancaster. And Portsmouth is the original name of Middletown. Yeah. And so that was the original railroad. They were chartered in 1832, and the tracks were completed in 1838. And that was how you traveled by train between Harrisburg and Lancaster, that railroad. There we see 1838 line put into they they didn't waste a lot of time building bridges and all. They just went around everything that was in the way. And at Elizabethtown, you've all heard of the famous tunnel that used to be there. It was an 850-foot long tunnel. They continually had problems with it collapsing, and so eventually, when the Pennsylvania Railroad took over, they blew the top of it off and opened it up. And now today, out there, right outside, it's just a great big giant cut that the tracks go through. That used to be the famous tunnel. 1857, the Pennsylvania acquires the State Public Works, and a lot of the railroads in this area are taken over by the Pennsylvania Railroad. So our railroad was folded into the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1857. Or here in 1860, they acquired the Harrisburg Force at Mountjoy and Lancaster. Here's an original stock certificate. It was more commonly known simply as the Harrisburg and Lancaster. It was a full amount to say the whole railroad. Okay, so this is a very interesting photograph. This is a 1938 aerial view of Elizabethtown. Looks like it's taken at about 1,500 feet. Now, to get you oriented here, this is the if you kind of see, this is the main line here, this big line going through there. Now today, that's the main line, the Pennsylvania Main Line Road, which is the Amtrak line today. And where this, I don't know if this corner is working, there's this red arrow down here, and that is High Street. And you can see down here in the right corner is the what's the Amtrak station today. So where this red arrow is down here, that's where the original railroad came through the Ironstone Ranch. And you can kind of see it made a great big S-curve, and those red arrows are showing it. And it made this big S-curve through the Ironstone Ranch because from a geology standpoint, the whole area is a boulder field. So some glacier must have come through, and so they just, you know, they didn't remove boulders. They just put the tracks. That was the easiest way to get into Elizabethtown. In the late 1800s, the Pennsylvania Railroad decided to make the line from Harrisburg to Philadelphia, to upgrade it and to being what they considered a high-speed line. So that was raising the tracks all up, and that's why today, if you ride on the Amtrak train, it's all up high, and they put tunnels underneath for wagons and then eventually automobiles to cut down on the grade crossings. And that project was started in the late 1890s. They had completed the High Line through Elizabethtown in 1903. And so in 1903 is when the tracks through the original tracks of the original railroad through Elizabethtown were removed. And since this picture I showed you here, that's 1938, so that's some 30 years later, and you can still see the right-of-way where the tracks were going, and so the Ironstone Ranch and the farmers were using that railroad bed as a road to get from, you know, Newville Road over into downtown. So when the Abels bought the property, and this pretty much shows the property here. It's 275 acres, and when they bought the property, there's this half a mile of this railroad roadbed that's all clear, trees are cleared, that is there, and that's when they learned that the Lincoln's funeral train ran across this property that they had purchased. So when they saw the replica of the Lincoln funeral car, it was Mrs. Abel's idea of, well, why don't we build a railroad on our property and put tracks back down on this original right-of-way? And so that's what our plan is, and this yellow line here on the property shows you what our railroad is. Now, right now, we have about 2/3 of a mile of the track was installed on the original Lincoln Road bed. And so for some of those that came to our event and saw the train and rode it, that's what we're doing now, is just going back and forth on that track. We'll build another 2.5 miles, and we'll end up with a 3-mile railroad. And you can see well, I guess this is not working, but you all see where the Star Barn is. For those of you familiar with the property, this here is the Star Barn complex, and this is the original 1860 ironstone ranch house and ironstone farm. So over here is Market Street, and so we'll have a turntable down here at this end, and these 2 tracks, and the main line will go up and make this big loop, and up here at the top of the loop, the train is going to go through 1/2 of the 1844 Herr Mills covered bridge. And and then there's a spur line that will go back about 1/4 of a mile back to that complex up at the top, which is going to be the Belmont Barn. Some of you may know about that. The Belmont Barn was up at the Fruitville Pike exit, and when the Target Shopping Center went in, the barn had to go. The house is still there as a museum. The Abels got that barn just like they did with the Star Barn and took it apart board by board, and it's all been in storage. And they are going to rebuild the Belmont Barn. We will have our turntable is going to be, let's see what well, here's a picture of Lincoln's funeral train route. So that's the route that he went on his train. It's kind of hard to see, but you can see where Harrisburg is up there in that corner. All right. Well, this is a close-up of the locomotive that pulled Lincoln's funeral train, and you can see all the flags and the bunting. So to recreate for our locomotive, now the locomotive we have is a replica of an 1868 locomotive. This locomotive is from 1864. So ours is very similar. It's not a replica of this engine, but it's very similar to this locomotive. We got all the bunting. Oh, now do I use this? Okay, here's a picture that shows all the bunting. Each of the railroads different railroads were responsible for decorating their locomotives and the cars. It was a 9-car train. And Lincoln's car was second to the last, with the officer's car was on the rear of the train. Let's see what this does. Well, you gave me 2 of these. Now which one do I use?
Use the black one to advance, the white one to use the original one.
I'm great at winding up Victrolas. Okay. All right, I can kill more time. Yeah. Okay, so this is our locomotive. This locomotive is a replica of an 1868 locomotive built by the Schenectady Locomotive Works in New York. And its history was that in 1868, the Central Pacific Railroad, which was the railroad that was one of the 2 railroads that built the Transcontinental Railroad. And hopefully, maybe most of you all realize that just a few days ago, on May 10th, was the 150th anniversary of the driving of the Gold Spike. Well, the Central Pacific came from Sacramento, and the Union Pacific came from the east. Well, in 1868, the year before, the Central Pacific knew that they needed more locomotives, so they ordered 4 identical locomotives from the Schenectady Locomotive Works. And there were locomotives number 60 through 64, and they each had a name. And one was the Jupiter, one was the Leviathan, the Whirlwind, and the Storm. So the Jupiter, of course, is the one that ended up at Promontory Point. You've seen the famous photograph with the two locomotives, right? Well, the Leviathan, number 63, was actually scheduled to be the locomotive, and it was pulling the dignitary, Governor Stanford, and the dignitaries out of Sacramento. And before it got up into the mountains, some freight train crew had left a flat car of lumber sticking out on the main line and didn't clear into a siding, and the Leviathan smashed into it. And so they got the Leviathan off the train, and the Jupiter happened to be sitting there on standby. And so the Jupiter was the locomotive that ended up at Promontory. So when the gentleman who built this replica in 2009, when he built this replica, there was already a replica built in 1974 of the Jupiter, so he wasn't going to name it the Jupiter, so he liked the other name Leviathan. And so that's the heritage of this locomotive. This is, when you see these black and white photographs from the Civil War of these steam locomotives, we're looking at black and white glass plates, and if you were to see those pictures in color, this is what you would see. Locomotives in the 19th century were all painted in bright colors, the bright brass work, all of this was rigor de jour. And it was, you know, it was mechanical, but it had to be beautiful. So, go ahead. And so here's there's David Clokey himself. He's working on the truck frames. That's what we call the wheel sets, the whole wheels for the Lincoln car. Next. All right. Just a couple weeks ago, we got a new coach. Mr. Clokey built this coach, and it shows it arriving to us in Elizabethtown. This coach is a replica of an 1848 coach called the Pioneer Coach that was used on the first westbound passenger train out of Chicago in 1848. It was the Galena, Chicago, and Union Railroad. And in 1948, for the 100th anniversary, the Chicago Northwestern built a replica of the Pioneer train. The locomotive did not survive, and the coach survived, the replica coach survived until the 1980s, and Dave Clokey purchased the remains of it. And so using the remains of that replica, he built this car. And so this is a replica of that 1848 Pioneer coach. So that's one of the cars we have on our train right now. This shows you how the locomotive was transported. Dave Clokey built these special trailers, and so you can see the smokestack is back there on the back, and this trailer, you just get up close to the railroad tracks, and we lower the trailer down and have ramp rails and roll the locomotive off the trailer right onto the railroad tracks. So this is us getting ready to load all this stuff and put it on our railroad at E-Town. Go ahead. So the Lincoln funeral car. So the history with this car is very interesting. Prior to Abraham Lincoln, none of the presidents had private rail cars designated just for them. When the president wanted to travel by rail, the owner of the railroad would lend them a private car. And so during the Civil War, with the various death threats that Abraham Lincoln had, the War Department was on him and wanted funds to build a private rail car for him to travel in. And initially, President Lincoln was completely against the idea of spending any money for building a private railroad car for his use. His favorite form of travel during the war was actually by boat. And when he rode the train to go somewhere, like when he went to Gettysburg, he rode in the day coach, and he liked to sit with all the kids and the mothers and the children running around. And on his train trip to Gettysburg, he sat in the day coach with his briefcase on his lap, making notes on his speech. So he was very simple. He did not like fancy, did not like anything elaborate. But he eventually agreed to the War Department's demands that a private rail car be built for him. So the U.S. military railroad had built this car. It was basically the Air Force One of its day. The car was christened the United States. It had 2 staterooms in it, one for him and one for his wife, and then a parlor, and then an area for an office area for meetings. It had this extra set of wheel sets underneath of it because of the weight of the car, and also it was very technically very complicated, but they could actually change the gauge of the wheel sets so the car could go on railroads of different gauges, because at that time there were many different gauges of railroads tracks. They hadn't standardized that at this time. Go ahead. So here's the frame. So instead of being completely built out of wood, it has a steel frame that he started with. And here's some pictures of them working on the car in the shop near Elgin, Illinois. Now there are no photographs of the original interior of the Lincoln car. There were lots of newspaper accounts, written accounts of what the inside looked like. No photographs, no engravings, but there are lots of pictures of the outside of the car, lots of photographs. So the outside of our replica car is just about as authentic as it could possibly get. And the inside is as close as that can be done based on the written accounts. Next. Just some more pictures of them building this. This has that roof up there that's known as a Clarostory Roof, and this particular type of Clarostory Roof is called a monitor top, and it gets its name because of the Monitor submarine that had that top piece. So that's why this got nicknamed a monitor roof. Go ahead. Now, this is the wheel sets, and you can see here the U.S. On the pedestals there, and that is made from a casting of the original car. So what happened to the original car? So the car was built in 1865. The car was built and finished by the time Lincoln had his second inaugural, and on his day calendar of appointments on his desk, him and Mary Todd were going to go look at their new railroad car on the morning of April 15th. Well, he didn't see it. So at that point, when Secretary Stanton came up with the idea of the funeral train procession, they took out one of the bedrooms so it could accommodate his coffin. And as a lot of you may know, Lincoln's son Willie had died 3 years earlier. And when Willie died, they knew that when they went back to Springfield, they would take Willie's remains with them to be buried in the family plot. So on the Lincoln funeral train, on one end of the car was Lincoln's coffin, and on the other side of the car, inside, was Willie's coffin. Mary Todd refused to ride on the train at any time. Secretary Stanton had ordered photographs taken, as many photographs as possible taken of the Lincoln, the funeral train procession. At a number of cities, they would take the coffin out of the car and would put it in the state capitol to lay in state, open coffin. Newspaper recounts recall that by the time they got to New York City, that there were lots of complaints from folks of his decaying body. So after New York City, it was a closed casket. When Stanton wanted a record, a photographic record of all of this, and Mary Todd refused. She ordered all the glass plates to be destroyed. She wanted no reference whatsoever of this. She was so distraught over the whole entire experience. And Secretary Warsten obliged her. He destroyed all of the glass plates except for one. And if you've seen that picture, it's a photograph of an open casket of him laying in state. I think it's in New York. And that's the only photograph that exists because Stanton hid that and kept it for posterity. So go ahead, next. Here's a good close-up of the car as it was brought on the trailer. Go ahead, next. And here's the car put together. So what happens after Lincoln's funeral? The train gets to Springfield. He's interred in Springfield. And at this time, still the railroads, the northern railroads were all being run by the U.S. military. The military had taken over the northern railroads during the war. The car was shipped back to Alexandria, Virginia, to the railway shops. The next president did not want to use the car or have anything to do with it. So it sat there for about a year and a half, and then the military railroad, they sold it to the Union Pacific Railroad. The car ended up going out west and was used as an office car at the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Next picture. And this picture actually just surfaced, not just like months ago. This picture was found. So this is 1869. This is right before May 10th. And there is the Lincoln car on the rear of the train. And you can still see the presidential seal that's on the side. And what's very interesting about this is all of these are the Pawnee. And the Pawnees were the first tribe of Indians that had pretty much given up the fight. And they had gone to work for the Union Pacific Railroad. And they worked as scouts and also helped protect the railroad workers as they were laying tracks. So this was the ceremonial picture of the Pawnee, and the chief, the Pawnee chief is there in the middle. And so, like I said, this picture just surfaced like maybe 3 or 4 months ago. Very interesting to see it in this state. Go to the next picture. So, the Union Pacific Railroad has the car until about 1872 or 73. They sell it to the Colorado Central Railroad. They take out all the fancy appointments, and it's now used to haul railroad track workers around. And finally, by the 1890s, the thing is pretty much falling apart, and a real estate promoter from St. Paul, Minneapolis, bought the car, and he took it on tour and was trying to raise funds to restore it. And this is one of those efforts. Here is the car at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. He was very unsuccessful at raising money. There was very little interest in it. The car ended up going back to St. Paul, and it was put in the shed. And in 1911, some young boys were out burning grass to clear a field, and sparks flew over and caught the shed on fire, and the shed and the car burnt to the ground in 1911. And only thing that was saved from the car was one of those cast iron pedestals that you saw earlier that had the U.S. flag symbol on it, the U.S. And so on our replica car, the pattern for that came from the original car. It's one of the only original pieces that's on the replica. Next. So here's the railroad track bed that runs, looked like it runs through the property at the Ironstone Ranch. This is right after our rail contractor started laying the rail out. But this is the Ironstone Ranch folks have been doing wagon rides and horse-drawn carriage rides on this. Next. And these are just some construction photos. The railroad track company we used is out of Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, and they put in this 0.06 miles of track. They did it in 20 days. So we can go next one. This shows them laying the ties out. Go again. They brought in the machine. This is the tamping machine that tamps all the ballast underneath the ties. Next. And then the last thing is the ballast regulator. And this machine has a big brush in the front there, and it brushes all the ballast off the top of the ties. And it has these wings on the side that can come down and make ditches and form the angle of the rock on the side. And there's yours truly with us making our first trip on the rebuilt track right before our event. What's the next picture? Well, here is, you've all heard about the Herr Mills Covered Bridge, 1844. The bridge, if you ever saw it over there in Paradise, it's basically was two bridges that were put together. So Mr. Abel has taken half of the bridge and he's put it up here, and when you drive on the property, you'll be able to drive through the covered bridge and cross over the tracks. And then when we build the other portion of the railroad, we're going to put the other half of the bridge over the tracks so the train will go through the other half of the covered bridge. Now what's next? And here is our attempt at our bunting and decorating. We studied the photographs from Harrisburg. We actually, there's a flag company that makes American flags. We had them replicate the flags that were used in 1865. So those are the correct flags for that. On the front, there's a branch in the way, which you can see Lincoln's portrait that was on the front. So that was really something to recreate this. Is there another picture? And I think this is the last one. Here's some of the Civil War reenactors that have came. And it was just an incredible event. We replicated the event on April 22nd, which was a Monday this year. The train pulled into Elizabethtown at 12:15, and I'm very proud to say that I managed to pull the train to the end of the track and stop exactly at 12:15. So a highlight of my engineering career. And then we had about 2,200 people there on Monday, April 22nd, and we probably had another 1,000 people on the next day, Tuesday. And for those of you who weren't there, we had a sutlers camp. We had Ulysses S. General Grant was there with his camp. We had cannon, Civil War cannons. They had a tent set up, and a lot of the reenactors had billeted overnight on the property. And so that's one of the things that they want to do here on the ranch is they want to have Civil War reenactor groups be able to come and stay on the property and bill it and participate with this. And now there's a train. Is there? I think. Okay. This is a picture of our turntable. It's going to look like this. This is the turntable at the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Carson City. They're lending us all the drawings and castings to make that, so we will have an 1872 turntable. Next one will show, this is the water tower at the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, Colorado. We're going to replicate this tower because it's a smaller one. It's a 9,000-gallon tank, but they have all the plans and drawings for that they're going to lend us, so we're going to build that, and it'll be an actual working water tower. And is there anything else? And that's it. So that's my story. Okay, good. Any questions, please? Yes.
Do you have any idea what the weight is of the locomotive?
The weight of the locomotive. The locomotive weighs 35 tons.
That's the same weight of Sherman tank.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, the locomotive weighs 35 tons, which is small, is lightweight. The coaches, the Pioneer coach weighs, it probably weighs about 28 tons. And the Lincoln car, it weighs just about a little less than the locomotive does. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment.
Yes.
Is it true that on the reproduction train, the coffin that's on there was made by the same company
Yes.
that made the original one for Lincoln?
Yes. So the coffin that we have on the Lincoln car is an exact replica built by the same company that built the original coffin that Lincoln had. They are still in business. And what's even more interesting, I think, than the coffin is that the carpet, the wool carpet that we have in the car, was made by a carpet mill company in York that's still in business, and there was about a 14-inch square piece of the original carpet that had survived when they built the car in 1865. Plus, they had the pattern for it over in York, and so they used the same loom and machine from 1865 to build the carpet for our replica car. How about that? That's really something.
Do you know the name of the company in York?
I do not know.
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
It worked with my hometown.
Yes. So that's another question. Yes.
Did the train stop at the Leviathan for water?
You know, I don't think it stopped for water. It stopped for 15 minutes, and I've never seen that in any written, you know. We know that it stopped in Mount Joy. You know.
The story was that they stopped there to get water
Okay.
from that water tank.
Oh, okay. Very good.
I mean, I don't know if that's
No,
true or not.
that could be
That's
true.
the story I heard.
Absolutely.
So, you know, why did it stop for 15 minutes in Elizabeth time? It had to stop for a purpose. And the story was to get water, to pick up water.
Well, that makes sense. Any, yes, sir?
A few years ago, I took a ride on a steam locomotive that went out of New Freedom,
Yes.
and it was known as the Lincoln Funeral Train. Was there any connection here?
Yeah, so in 2013, we took the Leviathan steam engine to New Freedom, and the locomotive that they have, they have an operation over there called Steam into History, and they have a replica steam locomotive that the same man that built ours built theirs. And so in 2013, we took the Leviathan there so we could do a reenactment on May 10th. May 10th is our is the anniversary of the driving of the Gold Spike. So yes, we did see that. Yes.
I have a question on this map.
Yes.
These are the storage sheds?
So that right there, that is going to be the Belmont Barn, and the largest right there where you got your pointer, that's the Belmont Barn. And there's going to be 2 tracks that go inside the Belmont Barn. The Belmont Barn is bigger than the Star Barn. I think it's something like 85,000 square feet. And the Belmont Barn is 4 stories. So on the first floor, there'll be 2 tracks going inside that the Lincoln car will be in, and we'll keep the locomotive in there when it's not running. And that floor is going to be a railroad museum. Some of you may know that the Ables purchased the National Christmas Center from Gap or Paradise. And we didn't buy the building, but we bought all the contents. And that is an amazing, I have never seen anything like that. Has anybody been to the National Christmas Center? Right. So it has all of it. So all of that stuff inside is all now been packed up, and everything is going to be restored. And the Belmont Barn on I believe the 2nd or 3rd floor is we're gonna recreate the National Christmas Center displays. And so that's that whole Belmont Farm complex that they're gonna start, maybe this fall or early next year.
So my question is, if the train starts here and comes around,
Yes, you go around like that, keep going, go down there, keep going, now stop.
what happens here?
Well,
This is an awfully
wait,
wide turn.
well, go back, go right back, stop. Come down, stop. Right there, we cut the locomotive off and leave the passenger car sit right there. And then the locomotive goes down to the turntable. We will turn the locomotive around. The locomotive will come up on the right side and go around the cars, back up and pick up the cars. And then when we head back to the west, we go to the right. And we go up like that and make this curve, keep going, stop the train, throw the switch, and then the train will back up to the Belmont Barn. Wow. So that will be what the train experience will be on the property. Yeah, we're building an 1860s railroad. We have our switch stands are 1869 Union Pacific, what's called harp switch stands, the type of switch stands that they would, when you change the tracks and everything. If you point the pointer up, come down, yeah, follow the track down, keep going. So now right about there, there's a big ravine and a boulder field. There's going to be a 420-foot long open deck wooden timber trestle that the train's going to go over. So it's quite amazing. Quite amazing. Any other questions?
How long do they anticipate? How long do they anticipate all this taking?
Well,
to get it back in? I mean,
right now we have the first, almost, more than half a mile. And so right now when we have events, the train ride will start down here on the east end and we'll just shove the train back and just go back and forth. So it will be a 1 mile round trip ride. When they start construction for the Belmont Barn, the ground and when they excavate for that, then most of that is going to be used for the fills and that we have to put in for building the rest of the railroad. This first half a mile we put in was easy because the roadbed was already there. We didn't have to do anything but just put the tracks and the ballast in. The rest of the railroad we've got to carve out of like just nothing that's there. So whatever the time schedule is for the Belmont Barn. The next, and what the plan is here on the property, as you know, it's a wedding events. They do weddings and corporate events, but they're planning once a month events that are open to the public. And as many of you may know, the Abels are not greedy people. All of the net profits from this property go to the Brittany's Hope Foundation, which feeds children worldwide. So they take no money from this. And so once a month we'll be open to the general public, and now we'll have the train experience as well as the wagon rides, and the Star Barn will be open, and there's a petting zoo, and they just, and museum pieces to look at, and that's what Mr. Abel is trying to do. He is trying to, the idea is on this 275 acres is to ultimately have 5 different areas that are recreations of actual, farmhouses and buildings, and he's trying to save that part of Lancaster County history and the Pennsylvania history for generations of people to see what this was like. So that's what the whole point of it is. He stated that he doesn't want us to be a tourist railroad that is running all the time on a regular schedule. There's lots of great tourist railroads right here in our own backyard. So we have no intention of competing with those. But our next event will be on Friday, May 24th. And I have some flyers up here on the front of the table, if you'd like to take one, that has our schedule for the next 4 months. And there's also a booklet up here about the Star Barn, if you'd like to take that. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Ma'am,
I'd like to make a comment and then ask a question.
go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I have been so impressed with this presentation. Rick, next spring, our trip. Okay, now, I did notice, I paid attention, the owner made a comment about, not allowing LGBT carriers.
Sure.
Do you honestly feel that is for business?
Well, I don't really want to speak for Mr. Abel on this because it has been such a big thing in the news. But I have heard Mr. Abel say to all of us at one of our staff meetings, he does not believe, he doesn't believe in labels, and he's not using any labeled names, and he said he's not using any alphabets. He believes that all 700 billion people on this planet, he believes, are all children of God, made in God's image. And that's what he believes. And there have been some extreme, I've only seen a few of them. There have been some extremely horrible emails that were sent. The worst one I saw was, you and your wife should be tied to the rafters of the Star Barn and it all burnt down and you died with it. So he's really taking a hit for this, and they have, they don't want to do same-sex marriages, but wedding receptions and things like that, it's okay. It's just against their principles to do that. They have been doing these weddings for 7.5 years. There's never been a problem with it up until now because the catering director always directs those folks to the other nearby venues that do that. There's never been a problem that anybody's ever seen. This time, as it was discovered, the ringleader, if not to keep too pejorative, but one of the instigators was a fellow and his partner that owned one of these venues that specializes in same-sex marriages. And so they started this publicity campaign to cause all of this. So Mr. Abel has taken this, he feels it's the biggest challenge in his life that God has put before him. And they have reached out to all of the negative folks that they actually, believe it or not, they are responding. Thousands, and I mean thousands of letters personally signed by him are going to every single person that sent an email, whether it was good or bad. And a lot of the people that were, some of the politicians, they have invited to the property. And some have taken up that invitation and some have not. So it's I don't think to answer your question, I don't think it's hurt our business. 2/3 of the emails and letters were very positive from folks that were like, stick by your guns and, by your beliefs. But it's been a real test of faith for all of us there.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
This time framing this is my certificate of participation, and there it is. Special thank you to Steve Torrico. I really thank you very much.
And here's a little treat for you going back to E-Town with.
Oh boy.
And then here's your compensation.
Oh,
and so
my
forth. Let's give Steve another nice.